Genotype and Phenotype. So here's a big question. Do our genes always match our traits? To understand that question, we're going to have to get some new vocabulary, so make sure that these terms are written down. First up is genotype. Genotype refers to an organism's set of genes. So their DNA, they're genes that are inside their cells. Phenotype, on the other hand, refers to an organism's observable traits, what we can see that has been expressed on the outside. Now it's important to remember that genotype determines phenotype. The genes inside of an organism determine the traits that we can observe outside. And for every trait, there are possible varieties. For example, the same flower species might have different colored flowers. There's a variety in those traits. You might have two snails with different sized shells. There's a variety in those traits, or the length of a bird's beak. These different varieties of genes are called alleles. Now to go back, remember that different genes code for different traits. You might have a gene for wings, you might have a gene for hair color or eye color, speed. There's a gene for each of the traits that we can see. And all organisms have two copies of each gene. That is incredibly important. For everything, size of wings, hair color, speed, there's two genes in the genotype. When it comes to alleles, alleles are just one form of a gene. And with each allele, there's a dominant and a recessive allele. Dominant alleles. Think about the word dominant. Dominant alleles always are expressed. They can always be seen. So an organism with a dominant allele, you will always see that dominant trait. We always represent dominant alleles with a capital letter. Now I promise this will make more sense in about a second. For every dominant allele, there's a recessive allele, or there's a recessive form of a gene. Recessive alleles are only expressed if there is no dominant allele. And we will represent recessive genes with a lowercase letter. So what does this all look like? Let's go through an example with eye color. Here's your possible alleles. Let's say there's a capital B, which is a dominant gene for brown eyes. And we could represent lowercase b to be the recessive gene for blue eyes. Remember that organisms always have two copies of each gene. So here's all the possible genotypes. An organism could be capital B lowercase b, or two lowercase b's. But what phenotypes would come out of that? Well, if an organism had two capital B's, they had two dominant genes, two dominant alleles, well then that organism would have brown eyes. If they had one dominant and one recessive, that organism would still have brown eyes, because remember, the dominant allele is the one that is expressed. If an organism has a dominant and a recessive, we only see the dominant allele. Finally, an organism with two recessive alleles would then have the recessive trait, in this case, blue eyes. What if we do another example with how hairy something is? Again, here's your alleles. Capital H is going to represent the dominant gene for being hairy. Lowercase h is going to represent the recessive gene or the recessive allele for being hairless. The possible genotypes are two capitals, so capital H, a capital and a lowercase, or two lowercase alleles. And what would these phenotypes be, right? What could be the possible outcomes that we would see? Well, if you have an organism with two capital or two dominant alleles, that organism would be hairy. If they have one allele for being hairy and one for being hairless, the dominant allele is the one that we see. So in this case, this organism would also be hairy. It's only when you have two recessive alleles, in this case the lowercase h, that you would have a hairless animal. Because again, recessive alleles are only expressed when there's no dominant alleles in the genotype. So, do our genes always match our traits? Well, not all the time. Sometimes you can have a gene for a recessive trait that isn't expressed because you have a dominant allele as well. So here's our key ideas. First, genotype refers to an organism's genetics, their genes, while phenotype refers to an organism's traits, what we can see on the outside. Remember that organisms have two copies of each gene. Genes also come in varieties. We call the varieties alleles. And dominant alleles overpower, or are the ones that are expressed over recessive alleles.